There's a moment, a decisive split second, that we all know intimately. Someone accuses us, questions our intentions, our character, our worth. And in that instant, without even thinking, we do what we've been taught since childhood. We justify ourselves. I didn't mean that. You misunderstood me. I'm not like that. Let me explain. It's such an automatic reflex, so universal, that we rarely stop to ask ourselves, does it really work? The psychological truth that this great Swiss psychiatrist observed through decades of clinical practice is brutal in its simplicity. The moment you justify yourself, you've already lost. Not because the accusation is true, but because you've unconsciously accepted the role of the accused. You've allowed the other person to become the judge of your worth. What most people don't understand is that every justification stems from the activation of a primordial archetype, the inner judge. This eminent psychoanalyst identified this psychic complex as a formation that develops during childhood through dynamics with parental figures, leading us to believe we must constantly prove our innocence to be accepted. But this is a trap of the infantile psyche that keeps the individual in a state of perpetual emotional dependence. When someone accuses you and you immediately defend yourself, you're projecting onto them the authority of the critical parent. You're unconsciously elevating them to a position of power over you. And they, perceiving this dynamic, naturally assume that role. It's a psychological game as old as humanity itself, but devastating for those who don't recognize it. The renowned analyst observed a fascinating paradox. The more a person justifies themselves, the less credible they appear. It's not a matter of logic, but of unconscious dynamics. When you frantically explain yourself, your unconscious betrays anxiety, insecurity, fear of rejection. And the collective unconscious perceives these signals long before the rational mind processes them. People don't decide whether to trust you based on your words, but on what their unconscious perceives of your psychic energy. An individual who justifies themselves emanates the energy of someone who has something to hide, even when completely innocent. It's the same reason pathological liars often appear more convincing than truly innocent people. They've learned to control this energy. From a neurobiological standpoint, justification activates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response. The body produces cortisol and adrenaline, altering voice tone, posture, facial micromovements. These nonverbal signals are perceived by the observer's amygdala, which interprets them as signs of threat or weakness. It's an evolutionary mechanism. Our ancestors had to quickly distinguish between who was strong and who was vulnerable for group survival. When instead you remain calm in the face of an accusation, your parasympathetic nervous system stays active. Breathing remains deep, voice stable, gaze steady. These signals communicate security and control at a precognitive level, triggering an involuntary respect response in the other. It's the difference between predator and prey energy, and the collective unconscious recognizes it immediately. In analytical psychology, the concept of shadow encompasses everything we refuse to recognize in ourselves. For most people, authentic personal power is part of the shadow. They've been conditioned to believe that being powerful means being bad, that assertiveness is aggression, that refusing to justify oneself is arrogance. But this pioneering psychologist understood that the truth is the opposite. Those who constantly justify themselves are afraid of their own power. They're afraid of being seen as bad if they don't bend to others' expectations. This unconscious terror of judgment keeps them in a psychological prison where their self-esteem constantly depends on external approval. A particularly insidious aspect of the tendency to justify oneself is its connection to what was identified as the savior complex. Many people develop an identity based on being good, understanding, available. When accused of something, their entire identity structure collapses, forcing them into desperate justifications to maintain this self-image. This pattern is often rooted in dysfunctional family dynamics where the child had to assume the role of the good one to maintain the family's emotional balance. As adults, they continue seeking this validation, becoming codependent on others' approval. Justification becomes their primary tool for maintaining this false identity. The insight emerges that when you learn not to justify yourself, you're integrating a fundamental aspect of your shadow, the right to exist without constantly having to prove your worth. This doesn't mean becoming cold or cruel, but recognizing that your validity as a human being is non-negotiable. Silence in the face of accusation isn't passivity. It's the mature expression of an integrated self that doesn't need external validation to know who it is. When someone attacks you and you remain calm, centered, non-reactive, you're communicating at an archetypal level. I know who I am, and your opinion doesn't change this reality. The analysis revealed how often those who accuse us unconsciously place us in what would later be called a double bind. Whatever we do, we lose. If we justify ourselves, we seem guilty. If we don't justify ourselves, we seem arrogant. It's a psychological trap designed to maintain control over us. The solution to this dilemma is to transcend the game itself. Don't accept the premise that we must choose between guilt and arrogance. Exist in a third space, that of the authentic self that needs neither to defend nor attack. This space of active neutrality confuses the accuser, who expects a binary reaction and instead finds a presence operating from a higher level of consciousness. A fascinating psychological phenomenon occurs when you refuse to justify yourself. The accuser begins to project their insecurities onto you. If you remain silent and centered while they become agitated, they unconsciously begin to perceive you as the strong parental figure and themselves as the child seeking attention. This reversal of power dynamics happens automatically. You don't need to do anything active. Your simple non-reactive presence activates in the other the wounded child complex that desperately seeks a reaction to feel important. And the more they seek this reaction without getting it, the more they expose themselves in their vulnerability. The concept of emotional containment emerged from this understanding, the ability to feel an emotion without having to immediately express it or act on it. When someone accuses you, it's natural to feel anger, frustration, or the need to defend yourself. But psychological maturity lies in containing these emotions long enough to consciously choose how to respond. This containment capacity distinguishes the psychological adult from the emotional child. The child reacts immediately to every stimulus. The adult has developed an internal space where they can observe their reactions before acting. This space is the place of true personal power. The anticipation of what would later be formalized as cognitive dissonance becomes apparent. When you don't justify yourself in the face of an accusation, you create a discrepancy in the accuser's mind. Their mind expects a defensive reaction, and when it doesn't come, they must reconcile this discrepancy. Often, the only way to do this is to begin doubting the validity of their own accusation. This process occurs at an unconscious level. The accuser begins to think, if they were really guilty, wouldn't they defend themselves? The fact that they remain so calm means maybe I was wrong. Your non-reaction becomes your most powerful defense because it forces the other to question their own perceptions. The process of individuation was conceived as the journey toward realizing the authentic self. One of the crucial passages in this process is freeing oneself from the tyranny of others' opinions. This doesn't mean becoming sociopathic or insensitive, but developing an internal center so solid that external emotional storms cannot shake it. When someone criticizes you and you don't react emotionally, you're demonstrating that you've reached a level of psychological maturity where your self-esteem doesn't depend on external consensus. You're operating from the self, not from the wounded ego. And this difference is perceptible at an unconscious level by anyone around you. The concept of transcendent function emerged as the psyche's ability to create synthesis between opposites. When someone accuses you, you're offered an opportunity to activate this function. Instead of falling into the accuser-accused polarity, you can transcend the conflict by operating from a higher level of consciousness. This transcendence isn't escape or denial. It's the ability to see conflict from a broader perspective, recognizing that often the accusation says more about the accuser than the accused. When you operate from this understanding, your natural response isn't defense, but compassion for the suffering that drives the other to attack. The study of ancient cultures revealed how the sage was one who spoke little and observed much. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood the power of unspoken words. Every time you refuse to justify yourself, you're activating this primordial archetype in the collective psyche. People unconsciously begin to project qualities of wisdom, mystery, depth onto you. Not because you're playing a role, but because you're embodying an archetypal model of authentic power that resonates in the collective unconscious. The observation emerged that the most respected people rarely explain themselves. They instinctively know that justification diminishes archetypal power. The understanding developed that true charisma doesn't arise from the ability to convince or manipulate, but from presence. It's the energy of someone who is completely at ease with themselves, who doesn't need external proof of their worth. When you stop justifying yourself, you naturally develop this charismatic quality. People are attracted to those who don't seek their approval because this behavior activates a psychological paradox. We want what we cannot easily obtain. When your approval becomes difficult to win because you don't depend on theirs, you automatically increase your perceived value. The theory emerged that when someone attacks you, they're offering you their psychic energy in the form of attention, even if negative. If you react by justifying yourself, you disperse this energy in frantic explanations. But if you remain centered, you can transform this energy into personal power. It's a process described as alchemical. You take the lead of accusation and, through your non-reaction, transform it into the gold of presence. The accuser, unconsciously, begins to feel that their energy has been absorbed and transformed by something greater than them. This creates a dynamic of involuntary respect. A particularly interesting phenomenon was identified that occurs when you maintain silence in the face of repeated accusations. The accuser begins to project onto you the qualities they unconsciously desire to possess. Your calm becomes their lost strength, your centeredness becomes their missing stability, your non-reactivity becomes their desired maturity. This process of inverted projection gradually transforms the conflictual dynamic into one of unconscious admiration. The accuser, while verbally continuing the attack, begins to feel respect for qualities they recognize as superior to their own. It's a defense mechanism of the psyche. When we cannot destroy what we perceive as stronger than us, we unconsciously begin to venerate it. The teaching emerged that many people erroneously believe that not justifying oneself means becoming hard or insensitive. But true psychological strength comes from integrating polarities. You can be vulnerable and powerful at the same time. You can be open and centered simultaneously. The difference lies in awareness. When you consciously choose not to react, you're operating from strength. When you react compulsively, you're operating from the wound. This distinction is fundamental for developing authentic power that doesn't rely on dominating others, but on mastering oneself. The concept of the inner witness developed. That part of the psyche that can observe its own emotional processes without completely identifying with them. When someone accuses you and you feel the impulse to defend yourself, the witness allows you to observe this impulse without automatically acting on it. This capacity for self-observation distinguishes mature consciousness from reactive consciousness. The witness doesn't judge the defensive impulse, but simply recognizes it as a conditioned pattern that can be transcended. Through this practice, you develop an inner freedom that no external accusation can touch. The observation was made that the moment you stop justifying yourself, something profound awakens in your psyche. It's as if an archetypal switch activates, connecting you to millennia of ancestral wisdom about what it means to be truly powerful. Not power over others, but power over yourself. This awakening is perceptible. People begin to treat you differently, not because you've done something specific, but because you've stopped doing something. You've stopped seeking their approval. And paradoxically, this often causes you to receive it automatically. Each refusal to justify oneself in the face of an accusation was conceived as allowing a part of your ego to die. That part that needs to be seen as good by everyone. It's a small death, but necessary for the birth of something more authentic. A self that knows it has value regardless of others' opinions. The recognition emerged that this transformation isn't easy. The ego will react, telling you that you're selfish, that you're hurting others, that you should explain. But if you can remain centered through this internal storm, you'll emerge with a form of power that no one can ever take from you. The unshakable certainty of your intrinsic worth. The intuition developed of what quantum physics would later confirm. Everything is energy, and energy influences surrounding energy. When you develop an authentic presence that doesn't need to justify itself, you create what we might call a presence field that influences the psychological environment around you. People enter this field and automatically calm down, become more centered, less reactive. It's not magic, but neurobiology. Mirror neurons in their brain begin to mirror your state of calm and centeredness. You become an unconscious reference point for others, an anchor of stability amid emotional chaos. The understanding emerged that silence, when born from inner strength rather than fear, has alchemical power. It transforms relational dynamics, purifies intentions, reveals true motivations. When you don't justify yourself, you force others to confront their own projections and insecurities. It's in this space of conscious silence that true communication occurs. Not through words, but through presence. And a centered, non-reactive presence communicates more powerfully than any explanation. I am who I am, and that is enough. The recognition developed that often our compulsion to justify ourselves derives from transgenerational traumas. Patterns of submission, fear of authority, need for approval that have been transmitted through generations. When you break this pattern in yourself, you're not only healing your psyche, but also healing the ancestral line. Every time you choose not to react defensively, you're rewriting your family's emotional code. You're demonstrating that it's possible to exist with dignity without constantly having to prove your worth. This healing radiates not only toward the future, but also symbolically toward the past, honoring ancestors who didn't have this possibility. A fundamental paradox was observed. The more someone feels the need to assert their authority through words, the less real authority they possess. Authentic authority doesn't need to proclaim itself. It manifests naturally through presence and coherent action. When you stop justifying yourself, you begin to emanate this type of silent authority. You're not telling people you're powerful. You're simply operating from a place of authentic power. And this difference is immediately perceptible at an unconscious level. People begin to treat you with a respect that you cannot force, but can only earn through the integrity of your presence. The concept of synchronicity was developed to describe meaningful coincidences that seem orchestrated by a higher intelligence. When you begin to no longer justify yourself, a relational synchronicity often occurs. People who were accustomed to manipulating you through accusations and criticisms naturally begin to distance themselves from your life, while more mature and respectful individuals are attracted to your new energy. This isn't coincidence, but a natural consequence of changing your energetic field. The understanding emerged that we attract experiences and people that mirror our level of consciousness. When you elevate your consciousness by refusing to participate in immature psychological games, you automatically attract healthier and more authentic relationships. This is the secret that was identified in great leaders, visionary artists, and sages of every era. Authentic power doesn't explain itself. It embodies itself. And when you embody it completely, the world has no choice but to recognize it.